Morning. Welcome to the second day of the oneM2M developer tutorial. And today we are going to start with the security topic. And we have two sessions for the oneM2M security. And the first one, as you can see from the screen, this is the oneM2M access control. So here's the outline. We skipped over different access control mechanisms in short on day one, and we are going to kind of discuss what are the access control mechanisms supported by oneM2M, and we are going to have some kind of practice with the kind of basic, or let me say kind of the most kind of commonly used mechanism, which is the access control policy resource type. And I will show you how it works, and then I will give you the short demo how to use them. So as a concept, access control in oneM2M is like this. I think you already kind of saw the kind of similar diagram like this before during the overview of oneM2M. So when originator, for example, oneM2M application entity, send a request to the receiver, which is the CSC, targeting a resource, then of course it will give the response back to the originator, but depending on the condition, maybe the request will be processed successfully, or in other case it could be kind of a failure, because in this case we are talking about the access control. Since the originator has no access privilege on this targeted resource or requested resource, then it could be denied. And how to decide that kind of regarding the access control is the topic for this session. So this is the target resource, and there will be the kind of binding information for the access privileges. So when someone hit this resource, then the CSC, the receiver, will find the matching privileges to make a decision if the CSC kind of grants and process the request, or just deny and send back the kind of failure response to the originator. In this case, this resource is linked to a privileges, and of course the privileges will be stored in the form of oneM2M resource, and kind of by the abstraction, AE1 has the right for the retrieve operation for this resource, so that is the linkage, and AE2 is an entity can do like create, retrieve, update, delete for this resource. So there are kind of different resources, but the access privileges as a separate resource is residing kind of differently. So for example, there are two different resources here and there, and they can kind of link to the same privileges because that's what the kind of application owner really wanted. So that's the flexibility while we are separating the resources that the other applications can access, and the privileges, they are separate resources. And in the example, I was kind of mentioning the privilege for the retrieve operation, or create, or update and delete, and we have the other, and we have defined in the oneM2M specification the privileges for the discovery as a separate one. Even the discovery can be requested with the retrieve operation, but ordinary retrieve is different from the discovery, so it is a kind of separate kind of operation in the privilege setting. And even we have defined the privileges for the notification notify operation. So if some endpoint, or in other words a resource, having a privilege for a specific entities to be allowed to send the notification, then we can say. So the decision makings will be done by the CSE as the receiver, and originator will send a request, and the request would be CRUD or discovery or notify. I am just kind of missing discovery here. So how they decide? So there are kind of three key elements or three key information for the access decision. So who can do something on what? For example, the AE1 can retrieve the container 1 resource. So those are the three kind of key information for CSE to make a access decision whenever it gets a request. And the ordinary one, which is the access control policy resource type, is, let me say, the static one or the basic one. And in release 2 we have added the other mechanism, something dynamically kind of configure the access privileges, and then we can use it. So there are different mechanisms defined in the oneM2M specification, and for more details you can refer to TS3, which is the security solutions. And the first one, this is the topic for this session with the practices, and we will be looking at it soon. And something dynamic, there is a dedicated resource type to use that feature, dynamic authorization consultation. So basically the difference is the ordinary access control policy, the privileges, even this diagram seems like the privilege is outside the receiver, which is the CSE, but this is just for your information as a depiction. But actually the privileges as an access control policy resource, this box, this is contained in the CSE, maybe the same CSE of the target resource or the different CSE of the target resource, but anyways, as a resource that is being contained in a CSE. In case of dynamic authorization consultation, that means the privilege information is residing outside the CSE. That means we can call it, okay, it's in the application side as a kind of separate system. So the interface to configure or update the access privileges would be really kind of dependent on that kind of third-party system, but there should be the flexibility, or they can have their own system they want. So whenever there is a request to the CSE targeting a resource like this, then in that case CSE should ask for the privilege information, for example, to the external system. Let's say this is the external system area, then can fetch the privilege information and make the decision. Or in the other case, it will just ask for the access decision itself to the outside system, like the consultation system, and the system will give us the answer, like, okay, you are going, that request that you have kind of requested for the decision, it should be granted or it should be denied. So that's the other option to use the dynamic authorization consultation. So this just for information. There's the other way of doing it for the access control mechanism, which is the basic one, and we can also use role for the entities. So AE1, for example, has a role 1, and role 1 will be defined in detail. With the role 1 can access to this resource and the other resource types and so on. So the thing is, we can make an access decision depending on the role that is given to an entity, for example, the application entity AE. And we can do the similar thing for the token, and in oneM2M we have a concept of token. And of course, whenever an application entity, for example, as in originator, send a request, he will kind of include also the token. The token will be validated by the CSE, and depending on the token and the access privilege with the token, there will be the access decision. So simply we can use row or token, but we will just focus on the access control policy as the access control policy resource type. So I said that there are kind of many different ways in the specification. So how do I use them in a harmonized way? And TS1, which is the functional architecture, defines the kind of code flow, how to use them, because depending on the system, by implementation, maybe I can support like two of them or three of them, and depending on the resource setting, in different cases, maybe I should kind of apply the first one and the other one, and not just this one. We have the concept for the access default access control policy. So there is the flow as a summary, which one should go first, and then the other. So if you're interested, then please kind of find the clause 10 to 3 in test 001. So let's see how it works with some kind of example resources settings. So we will focus on the access control policy resource or resource type. So again, I have elaborated the diagram from the previous slide, and now the originator is requesting the resource 1 for the retriever, for example. And resource 1, for example, resource 1 could be the container resource or group resource or the other resource. And let's say this is the container resource, and the container has the attribute named ACPI, and ACPI stands for access control policy IDs, meaning I told you that there is a link from the resources that we are requesting for access, and the privileges for that resource is linked from the targeted resource to the access control policy resource, because access control policy resource has all the privileges setting. So yeah, by the kind of CSE, he knows that the request is for the resource 1, and resource 1 has the privilege setting, and he can get the privilege information once he kind of check the ACPI attribute value, and with the link, then he is kind of fetching the other resource, which is the access control policy resource, like here. And there will be the access control policy setting, and this is just a kind of abstracted kind of diagram, and in reality this is just a kind of partial representation. I omitted the common attributes and universal attributes, but anyways, some important attributes only in this kind of JSON serialization example. So I said this is the access control policy resource, and in short we have a key like m2m colon ACP, and we have privileges, and each privilege has access control rules, and each rule has the originator and the operation that is allowed. So this is in fact serialized like this, represented like this. And from this slide we are going to face a lot of kind of short names for the attributes, short names for the resource type, short names for the parameter. And yeah, from day one we have the short name kind of finder, and when we use that, so as we kind of stated in the other slide, this is the link for the short name finder. And if you're interested, what is ACP, because you may forget what it is. ACP is the long name for short name for the access control policy, and that's the resource type. And what is ACPI? ACPI is the access control policy IDs, which occurs in many resources, and this is resource attribute. And from the slide, we are looking at a lot of kind of short names. What is PV? PV is the kind of privileges, and it is used in some kind of data type definition. And what we are interested at the moment is the resource attribute of the access control policy. So access control policy is the resource type having many attributes, and one of the attributes is privileges, and we just use the short name for it, which is PV. So just like that, maybe you can find what it is. ACOR, access control originators that we use for privilege and self-privilege. So when you kind of wonder some short names, then please use the tool. So here's the example that I'm going to show you right now. So this is a resource tree that we are going to try how the access control policy is working as the really kind of basic access control mechanism supported by oneM2M. So to test it, we are going to create the container CNT1, and container has the access control policy IDs, which is the reference to the access control policy or access privilege settings, like this way. So when someone is kind of trying to kind of retrieve, for example, the container one, then the CSE who gets that request, then he will find if there is an access control policy setting, and there it is, which is the Mobius/ACP1, which is this resources identifier. The identifier is like root resource slash the other resource slash the other resource. That's the structured resource identifier. So the identifier for the ACP that we are looking for is Mobius/ACP1. So CSE will fetch this resource representation, and with the given information, he will make the access decision. Since in our assumption, for example, CA1 retrieves CNT1, in the rules, each row is one rule. Access control originator who is CA1 can do something. 2 means retrieve, right here. And say 2 can do something for 63. So what is 63? So if you kind of sum up everything, then that is 63, meaning you can do create, retrieve, update, delete, notify, discovery. I mean CA2. So in case of the CA1's retriever on CNT1, it is allowed by this rule. In case of the CAE3's retriever on CNT1, there's no CAE3 at all, so it is denied, because basically all the access control rule in oneM2M's HP resource is whitelist. If you can find something in the list, then it is allowed, but if you cannot find anything, then it is not allowed. So that's what I meant by the whitelist. So let's try this out together. So here's the Mobius, and let's create the resource named CNT1 and with the kind of ACP setting. Even we have not created the ACP1 yet, but we can do that right after this kind of container creation. And just like the container, we are going to create the ACP resource right under the CC base resource. And by the setting, this is the Mobius, which is the CC base, the root resource. Or you can just kind of put all the kind of IP port address and then slash CC base resource name. So that's what you're looking at right now. So we are going to create ACP1 with this setting. You can just ignore the other property at the moment. So we have created that. And let's retrieve, as we say from the slide. So as a CAE1, let's retrieve CNT1. So I am now CAE1. to retrieve the CNT1. So I got it. And we have gonna put the ACP1 and the resource name like CNT1, and those are the other meta information filled in by the CSC. Some are the kind of universal and the common attributes. That is not so important for this tutorial at the moment. Because it was allowed by the rule, it is allowed. And let's say, okay, I am CAE3 and I want to get the CNT1. So let's say that I am CAE3. It is access denied because it is not listed anywhere in the access control rules. So how do you configure the access control operation number? Yeah, we already saw it, I think. So if you really want to kind of allow the create and retrieve only to a specific kind of entity, you should load the kind of entity ID and put it here. So having an array means you can allow the same operation to multiple entities. So you can have a list, and you will put in that case 3 instead of 63, for example. So so far we have been seeing that okay, container can have an ACPI, which is again access control policy IDs attribute in long. That is optional. And what about the other resource types? For example, some resource types does not define the ACPI at all in the specification. For example, content instance. So when we can retrieve a content instance does not have ACPI. It cannot have ACPI because one of the specification does not define that attribute at all. Then how do we use the access control policy resource for that? In case of content instance, it uses the parent resources as access privilege setting, which is the container resource. So yeah, when we try to kind of get the kind of content instance of the container, then always we use the kind of containers privilege setting. Maybe we can try that. Content instance. Let's create the instance for the container 1. It is access denied because we have set the setting like CA1 is only allowed for the retrieve operation, and to update, sorry, to create the resource, then we should use CA2 because that was the setting we put. So as the CA2, let's create the content instance to container 1. And we are trying to retrieve the content instance that we just created, but as we learned from day 1, we can just access to that resource without knowing the resource identifier, but we can just access to the LA, which is the latest virtual resource. And yeah, so the container 1, which has the kind of instance that we are going to retrieve, it can be retrieved by CAE1 and CAE2, so either one, but not CAE2. Yeah, not CA3. So we just got it, and CA3, he has no privilege to the container, so he has no privilege to get the child resource, which is the content instance of the CNT1. So that explains content instance does not define the ACPI attribute at all by the specification, but just use all the previous settings for the parent resource, which is the container. That's what we just watched. And in the other case, access control policy, which is the basically the information for all the previous setting like this. There is no ACPI attribute unlike the container or group the other resources. And the explanation would be kind of too much for you today, so I will just kind of skip it over. But just let you know then how to kind of set some kind of privileges to access to the access control policy ID resource. In the resource, there is the PVS, which stands for the self privilege. That means in the ACP, this is the privilege setting for the other resources like the container one or group one, whatever. And to set the privileges to access to this resource itself, we put it into the self privilege attribute value like this. So that's how we can do something. And yeah, okay, so some resource types can have the access control policy IDs attribute, but still it is optional. So that means if you want, then you don't have to kind of put it into the resource. So for example, like this, there is a container resource. This is the resource object representation named CNT2, and there's no ACPI. Then how do you make the access decision? I mean, we as the oneM2M platform, CSC, there is the kind of creator information contained by the kind of CSC and the creator of this resource. For example, if we create this one with CAE1, then CAE1 can do everything like create, update, delete, discover, notify. And later on, he can change the kind of ACPI attribute value to put a explicit access control policy setting, then it is allowable. So let's just have a practice on this kind of resource setting. Let's create the container, the other container without any ACPI. And the thing is, we are creating that one. We created it, and if we try to kind of get it, we say what was the ID? Say one. Yeah, we can get the resource. By the operation policy, Mobius allows create and retrieve operations for the any entities so far, but in the ordinary situation is not allowed. And if you can try to update this resource, which is the container 2 in our case, then it will not be performed, or it will be denied if you use the other entity other than CAE1. And now it's time for you to apply the access control mechanisms that we have learned in this session, and you can have your own practice from the device simulator from day one. So from day one, the last second project or trial that we had was like small home automation service. And depending on the luminosity sensor measurement, the buzzer or the lamp is turned on, and we use the lamp from day one. And let's say that depending on some kind of sensor measurement, there is the kind of buzzer kind of turned on. And with the access control mechanism, we can allow for some specific entity to kind of change something or upgrade something. So we can do that. So please kind of extend the kind of first day one's kind of project to allow the access to create the kind of new buzzer actuation messages, for example, so you can kind of protect the access to your own resources. So you can create some kind of access control policy resource and put it to the container for the buzzer actuator, something something. So that's the hint and good luck. Thank you.